Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good whatever time you're listening to this podcast. My name is James Albarn and welcome to episode 36 of The Last Line. I do apologise, I had to check there what episode we were on because it's been such a long time since I've done one of these, and I apologise to you, the listener, but I also apologise to the next 4 guests that I have lined up on the podcast that I've interviewed quite a while ago now, and their episodes are only just airing, so apologies to them, apologies to you, the listener, but we are back and we are going to try and be consistently back for the foreseeable future. Ignore my WhatsApp notifications going off on my laptop. That's very annoying. Should have muted that before I started podcasting, but hey, we're a bit rusty because we haven't done this in a while. So who is my guest today? My guest today is none other than Clive Stafford Smith, Clive Stafford Smith, OBE indeed, who is a British attorney who specialises in civil rights, and he works against the death penalty in the United States of America. He also has represented more than 80 of the detainees held in Guantanamo Bay. We do touch on that later on in the interview. He is the co-founder of Reprieve, a human rights not-for-profit organisation. He left Reprieve after 15 years and has now established a new non-profit called 3D Center. Links to all of those things in the description of the podcast. I talked to Clive in 2021, so almost 2 years ago now. So a lot has changed in the world since then. There have been many a prime minister in the UK, and many shuffles of government cabinets, etc. And there has been new presidents entering the US since then. So you will find sometimes the references are dated to 2021. Not 2001, sorry, 2021. But I do think it's a very sort of timeless conversation. It centres on effectively our justice systems, human rights, and to be honest, at this point, with everything that's going on at the moment in this country, without getting too political, I think there's sort of no better time to be listening to this conversation. And we start in an interesting place. I'd seen, while doing my research, that Clive had expressed that he preferred the US justice system to the UK's, which you don't often hear as a perspective. So I wanted to ask him why.
Well, let me illustrate it with a very simple fact. You were on a jury, right?
Yes.
And what sort of case was it?
It was a murder trial.
Okay, tell me everything that happened.
What, in terms of the murder trial or my...
In terms of the trial, your
day-to-day
experience, what you thought about it, what everyone talked about on the jury? I'm just about to interrupt you and say what you're about to do is a criminal offense. And it's my duty to advise you that if you answer my question, I'm going to have to get them to send you to prison. And, that's the first thing, right? Is that the British system, it's all people who went to school with me at some posh upper class private school, who think that if they sit around and they're all jolly good chaps, that everyone will trust them to do their job right. And they make it totally opaque and non-transparent. And they say that you as a juror can't talk about your experience. And their excuse for that is that if you're made to discuss that experience, you'll be harassed by nasty people like me. Now, is it true that you want to be protected from me and you don't want to talk about your experience as a juror?
No.
Of course not. The legal term for that, James, is total bullshit. And the reason really is that the British system says that the emperor wears no clothes and they don't want people talking about it. Because I get to talk to jurors all the time in America, and the things you learn I mean, I was doing this death penalty case in Virginia one time, and there were 12 jurors, right? And the issue in the penalty phase of a capital case is, do the aggravating circumstances outweigh the mitigating circumstances? And I established that the first 11 jurors didn't know what the word mitigating meant, which, doesn't give you much hope for them getting that right. But they all said, not all, but some of them said that the foreperson had a PhD in English and that she knew what the word mitigating meant. Well, we've forgotten it now. She told us. And she was the last person I talked to. And so, I mentioned this to her and I said, do you mind sharing with me what you told the other jurors? And she said, yeah, of course. I mean, the word mitigating means the same as aggravating. So having established that the education system's shit, we went on to why she convicted this chap and sentenced him to death. And the evidence against him had been a snitch and some really old-time serology in a blood evidence. And the snitch had recanted and said he lied. And the blood evidence, we'd done DNA testing, which showed not only did it not inculpate the guy, it excluded him, right? So I tell her that, the evidence she relied on to sentence him to death was just totally wrong. Would that make a difference to you? And she said, oh, no. So I said, really? Why not? And she says, well, in addition to my PhD in English, I've got ESP. And I consulted my crystal ball. I'm obviously paraphrasing what she said. I consulted my crystal ball, and this guy not only did this murder, he did 3 others. And that's why I sentenced him to death. That's what happened in a death penalty case, right? And she's allowed to talk about it because it's America. Whereas if you were in the room with some nutcase who wanted to do this guy for murder because of whatever, and you start talking about it, you go to prison. It's madness.
It's also, so what's interesting about that is, so in that case, are you then able to use that in a further either appeal, I don't know the correct term, like appeal, or to try and get your client off?
There are legal rules, right? So there are still stupid rules in America as there are in Britain. It's just they're much more stupid in Britain, which is surprising because let's face it, there was a time when I agreed with all your prejudices, James. And, I'd been in Mississippi long enough to think that there couldn't be anything worse. But actually, I was wrong. So in America, you can talk to the jurors about anything. I've very rarely had jurors not want to talk about it. As I love doing it. It's fascinating. You learn all sorts of interesting things. When I did the trials, I learned fascinating things about my own thing. One time, this juror argued with the other 11 jurors. He wanted to convict my client because he'd watched me all trial. And he'd decided that when I stood on the sides of my feet, I was lying. And in the closing argument, he correlated me standing on the sides of my feet with me saying that my client was innocent. Ergo, my client was guilty. And that was his reason for trying to sentence the guy to death. Fortunately, the other 11 talked him around, but I got to tell you, I've never stood on the sides of my feet since, So, you're allowed to find all of that stuff out. Now, there are still silly rules about what will get a case reversed. But, if, for example, you discover that the jurors had a Bible in the jury room and read it, and they decided that God was telling us to sentence him to death, the case will get reversed. And that sort of thing happens all the time.
I also think there's something weird about how we're not supposed to talk about it after the fact, or we're not allowed to talk. Supposed to is the wrong word. We're not allowed to talk about it after the fact. That I think is also somewhat an unrealistic expectation to put on the hundreds and hundreds of people that go through jury service every day. Hypothetically, I'm not saying I would have done it because I didn't, obviously. Let's make that clear on podcast.
He's sounding a teeny bit nervous. He knows that the constabulary is going to knock on his door.
No, but it's a really big deal for someone to, as I said to you, it's stuck with me since doing it. And, how many times, unless you go into the field you're in, how many times does someone have that kind of responsibility and etc. over someone's life, and to then expect them not to be able to talk about it to anyone afterwards seems, it seems unrealistic to me. It seems,
but there's something that's far worse than that, actually. My wife runs an innocence project here in Britain called Appeal. And she's in the middle of doing this case for the Freshwater Five, for 5 fishermen who are utterly wrongfully convicted of a drugs deal, picking up drugs in the middle of the channel. And so Emily's developed all this evidence to show that it just couldn't have happened. It's all nonsense. The police lied and so forth. Now, the jurors get to hear about that actually on a Guardian podcast. And if they hear about that, in my experience in America, those jurors are going to want to talk to us about it. And they're going to feel unbelievably betrayed that they were given this job of convicting people and sending them to prison for 104 years. And it turns out that actually the evidence wasn't what was presented to them, right? And, why can't they talk about it? And so then the Court of Appeal, and, I'm about to get myself in trouble here too, James, because I'm afraid I'm probably going to go down for contempt of court, but then I'm guilty of that. Because the Court of the judges in Britain, first they say, well, the jurors can't talk about anything about what they really believe, right? And then they went and wrote this long opinion about what the jurors believed, which was total bullshit again, because those guys have never talked to jurors either. They have no idea what jurors do. And so this is part of the British system where it's all constructed to have no transparency. And there are many, many worse things. I mean, if you want me to go off on a wild rant about that, I'm very pleased to.
I mean, feel free.
Good. Great. No, look, from the very beginning to the very end of the system. So in Britain, you don't get access to the police file. You don't get access to the prosecution file. Why not? If the government is trying to put you in prison for a long time, why won't they show you the evidence? Then it comes time we get it in America and Florida, we get to depose all the witnesses. I'm not saying the Americans always behave themselves, the prosecutors, but they're meant to.
Sure.
Then when it comes time for trial, in America, the client sits next to us. I once got to day 3 of a trial before the jurors decided I wasn't the defendant, because I always like to dress badly in court. And I dressed my client up really smartly, and they thought he was the lawyer. In Britain, you're up in this dock miles away from your lawyer, right? So, and it just says guilty all over you when you do that. And then, you don't get to pick a jury in this country. You just get the first 12 people who come along. You have no idea about these people's prejudices. In America, we get to question the jurors and see who they are and figure out whether they're biased,
I think that's a misconception. Sorry to interrupt, but I think that's also a misconception that people have about the UK system, unless they've been involved in some way. Because when I was on jury duty, I had people ask, do they ask you questions before you're put on the jury? And it's like, no, we don't do that over here. They do that in America, but they don't do that over here.
They used to do it over here, but they don't anymore.
And it is striking, because if you think, it does make you slightly worry if someone, I don't know, it's probably not a silly example because I'm sure it happens all the time, but if someone's like a massive racist.
Well, I was assuming that was you. Are you being all nervous there, James? You don't want to admit your phenomenal bigotry.
Yeah, you're on a massively racist podcast right now.
Well, my concern is I can see you and I can see you're drinking Coke. And, I don't think anyone who supports Coca-Cola should be allowed to have a podcast, frankly.
Sure. It is a worrying addiction of mine. But yeah, it does slightly worry you that, you could have, people who are massively prejudiced against someone, because the only thing they ask you is there any reason you can't stand on this trial?
Yeah, and you don't really know much about it. And, the question, is there any reason you can't be fair? Not a lot of people put their hand up and say, yeah, I'm a biased bastard. It just doesn't happen. Whereas, jury selection in America, I love it because I get to talk to the jurors. and I get to figure out who they really are and what they really care about. And, you've got to talk. One of the greatest lessons I ever learned during death penalty trials in the US was you have to talk the jurors' language. And the very first trial I did, look, I was very young. I was 25, 26. I was right out of law school. I had no idea what I was doing. When I say very young, I'm just trying to make you feel good, James, because you are young, whereas I'm old and decrepit. So I did what any pompous git who went to a private school in England would do. I quoted Shakespeare at the jurors, right? The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven. And this nice old lawyer came up to me afterwards and said, Clive, that's a mighty fine piece of poetry, but these here jurors, they don't know who Shakespeare is. I used that same quote last week in a trial, but I began by saying, I think it was in the book of Job I read. And then he quotes Shakespeare, right?
Nice.
And, the jurors love that if you say it's in the Bible. But if you say it's Shakespeare, they hate it. So you got to know who those jurors are and what language they speak and what they hear. And just to have 12 random people and you know nothing about them, and they know nothing in theory about you, and you don't know if they're racist, you don't know what they are. It's just impossible to have a sensible decision-making process.
Once I had done my jury service, I was talking to a Swedish friend of mine, and he was saying that they don't have juries in Sweden. And that made me think, when it was coming up to this, is and he couldn't get his head around. He found it baffling, the idea that we would ask 12 random people to judge.
Do you know why we have 12?
No, I don't think I do.
It's the 12 disciples. Almost everything in the British law is based on some ridiculous religion thing from 5,000 years ago. And
that sort of got me thinking about, your opinion on juries generally, in terms of how effective a system it is in the first place.
Well, it's a good question. Let me ask you this question. If you have to send someone to prison for a long time, how sure do you have to be?
Oh, I've seen you do this before, yeah.
Are you going to be a good guy or a bad guy, James?
Well, I would say you want to at least be in the 90s.
How high? You at least want to be
in the 90s.
How high in the 90s?
See, this is the thing, because I would say you at least want to be above 95%.
Okay.
So I saw you talked to Sean Atwood, and we had Sean Atwood on the podcast before. Mm-hmm. And he said 100, and you were like, no, you can't have 100. So he said, 99.
Because you're not sure that Coca-Cola can is really Coca-Cola and not the hallucinogenic stuff I put in.
Sure. So yeah, you want to be up in the high, very, very, very high 90s, don't you?
But I mean, let's say if you say 95%, that means you're aiming to get it wrong one time in 20, right? Yeah. Which means that if you've got 6 million Americans facing, prison, you're aiming to have 300,000 innocent people in prison. So that's not high enough. But I've done this to judges in England, and they average 83%. So they're aiming to get 1 in 6 wrong, which means they're aiming to have 1 million innocent people in prison. And, that's just crazy, right? And the problem is that 74% of British judges went to private school. They've never had any experience in the real world, ever. They've all pounced around in ridiculous wigs most of their lives. And they just have no idea what goes on out there. They really don't. I mean, I didn't. Let's face it. I went to the same school, and
I went to private school as well, so you can probably tell. But
this is a deeply embarrassing thing, James, to admit. Just how fucked up are you? I know I am. I've just written a book about it. Everyone can know all of my deep foibles. But look, the bottom line is, honestly, they mean well, those British judges, but they're so out of touch with the real world. I would vastly prefer to have a jury of 12 people who come from all walks of life and who can bring in some common sense to each other. But it's got to be 12 people who you've had a chance to really talk to get them to understand the importance of their role and how they can go about it and how they mustn't bully the other jurors. Because the reason you have 12 is, out of 12, you're going to have people with very different views. And if the vote is another stupid thing about the British, is that if the jurors vote 10-2 for conviction, In Britain, you can just say, oh, well, that's good enough for government work, and send a guy to prison. You can't do that in America because the minority view is rather important. If you're African American being trampled on by a white cop in Minnesota.
Sure.
So there are all of these things that are desperately important for people not to send people to prison. And I'm saving you. You are saved by British law from being interrogated by me about what you did to that guy on trial, right? There's otherwise I'd be all over you. Either you did the right thing, or I'd just rant at you for the next hour.
Sticking with the UK for the moment, a lot of your work revolves around the death penalty, and I know that under the first of all, it was surprising to me until yesterday when I was going down a whole death penalty, Clive Stafford Smith rabbit hole.
Oh, that's a very exciting rabbit hole to be in, sure.
It surprised me how late on the death penalty was actually fully abolished in the UK. I didn't realize it was like 98 or something.
Yeah,
when it was fully abolished for like treason and stuff. And I was sort of reading up about it, and I noticed that under
James,
the European
Convention, I just interrupt and say, you do preparation. This is just extraordinary.
I do do preparation.
God,
yeah. I'm glad you've noticed.
Do you have a little button you can press and you can have a little applause in the background? I think this is brilliant.
Well, thank you. But I noticed under the European Convention of Human Rights, we signed up to say we wouldn't put it back in place.
Would you like me to tell you a little Nigel Farage story?
Go on.
Yeah.
As long as it's about how he's awful.
Well, I mean, I would use a slightly stronger word than that. But
yeah.
I was having lunch with Nigel one day. I didn't realize because I was at a cricket match, and I didn't really know who he was at the time. And
right.
So anyway, when I worked out it was him, I was a bit bored. And I thought I'd have a go at him about the European Convention on Human Rights. Because actually the ECHR is not part of the European Union. It's got nothing to do with it. It was introduced by a Tory back in the 1940s. They were the ones who wrote it all up. It's a wonderful concept. And by getting out of Europe, you don't get out of the ECHR. But Nigel has made it one of his big things to say that it's the fundamental assault on being British. So I said, Nigel, I just have one question for you. I'd like you to identify for me one way, not 10 ways, just one way in which you have ever been harmed by human rights. And he did what he does best, which is guffaw and try and have another beer. But I wouldn't let him off, so I just kept on to the poor chap. And he couldn't come up with a single way that had ever been harmed by human rights, which of course he couldn't. And yet he makes this a central pillar of his whole platform for screwing up our country, while at the same time not realizing that has nothing to do with Europe anyhow. So there we go. That's just politicians at work, isn't it?
I mean, maybe there's a wider question about, do you think there's, because I know Priti Patel was quite vehemently for the death penalty at one point. I don't know if she still is, but I imagine her views haven't changed that much. Do you think there's a sort of public want for the death penalty, or do you think it's firmly, in Britain at least, I know obviously in the States still have it, do you think there's like a public perception that the death penalty is a good thing?
I think in Britain that we've gone way past that. And the truth is the British, it's all a big lie, right? I mean, the whole idea of the death penalty in America is that we have a really big problems in the US. We have, violence. I've been held up God knows how many times. There's big drug problems. There are big, no welfare. There's, all sorts of poverty. And so, as a politician, you have a choice. You can either say, oh, let's try and do something really sensible about it. And we'll abolish guns. We'll legalize drugs, maybe. We'll give people an NHS. We'll do all these things. And that will take years and years. And, everyone will say we're socialists. Or we can just say, let's fry a few black people and pretend that that's doing something about the problems. And, this is the big lie they always use. It's like, should we get out of Europe and that'll make the world a wonderful place again, or whatever. And so they're just lies. And I think it would be quite hard to sell to the British people at this day and age, largely because we'd show them the real side of it, which is, how many innocent people they keep executing.
Am I right in thinking that Arizona recently started using Zyklon B to carry out?
Oh, yeah.
Zyklon B, for listeners who don't know, is the same chemical compound that the Nazis used during the Holocaust. I think I'm right in saying. Why did they start doing that? Is that because they couldn't get hold of drugs because of? Well,
there is the drug
pandemic
thing. So the drugs. It's not. What happened was this: they were using lethal injection, and back in the day when no one noticed, they would pay 90 cents for each lethal injection vial, and they could go and kill people. But then the drug companies in America decided they didn't want to make it anymore. So they were only making very little money, and we did show the world that this is what they were doing. And you go to the website, and the website reflects that they make these wonderful drugs to save people's lives, and in fact they were doing the rest. So the drug companies decided they didn't want to be in this business. Perfectly sensible business decision on their part. So then the states want to make one giant leap for humankind backwards. And Arizona wants to go back to the gas chamber. And look, I have a slightly personal stake in this. I represented this guy, Edward Johnson, back in 1987. And, look, I'm here to tell you that if I knew then what I know now, he'd be alive today. And I'm convinced Edward was innocent. And, I feel, it's awful. It's a dreadful thing to carry around with you. But far more dreadful for poor Edward, obviously. And they gassed him to death. I had to watch them killing him in the gas chamber after they'd gassed a little black bunny rabbit in practice. And they used Zyklon B there, which is just a cyanide gas. And so we sued Mississippi on the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I'm half Jewish, and we had a Auschwitz survivor as one of our plaintiffs. And it's just awful that they think they should go back to that. And they're going to lose, right? We're going to sue them again, and they'll lose again because it's just so barbaric. But there's really not a terribly nice way of killing someone.
No, because I was re-listening to Adam Buxton's podcast with Maya Foer, from Reprieve. Mm-hmm. And they were talking in that about the way the lethal injection process works and the 3 stages of drugs, etc., and how obviously it's awful, but how basically if the first drug doesn't work that's supposed to put you to sleep, you're basically awake when you're essentially being tortured to death.
But the second one, that's the key thing in the 3-drug protocol, is the second drug. And the second drug is a paralytic agent. And the only reason to do that is to paralyze you. So if you are in agony, the people can't see it. And actually, it's very much the same as what they do with the electric chair, which is, oh, God, that's awful. I've had 2 of my guys die in that. And they have this horrible flap that they put over the face of the person who's being killed. And that's not for him, he's going to die a torturous, horrible death. That's for the witnesses so they can't see it because they'd throw up their dinner. All of these things are what they call the execution protocol. And it's a protocol for trying to, dehumanize the process such that people don't actually realize that we're burning witches at the stake, sort of thing.
Mm. And there was something in that podcast as well about how when they do, because the drug companies stopped saying we want to make these drugs anymore, they started sourcing them from all sorts of weird places. And there's a story that Maya tells in the Adam Buxton podcast about them selling this drug out the back of a driving school in Acton or something.
It was called Dream Farmer, and the driving school was El Begone Driving School. And, that's where they were getting it from. And so people were making money off these drugs from Europe. And it didn't take long for the British government to say you can't do that, because the ECHR really doesn't allow Britain to be involved in that either.
I don't want to go into the argument too much, because I feel like the arguments are sort of obvious, and I feel like obviously you probably retread that ground all the time. But how often do you because I just going off the Adam Buxton podcast, there's a bit where Maya says she avoids having the death penalty conversation with people and just sort of everyday conversation, because it's just like, you don't want to have to retread the old arguments and stuff, and it feels so obvious to you. How often do you find yourself in those sort of debates with people?
Oh, look, I really don't. I mean, because the truth is, I think I've probably had rather more experience of it than most people in Britain. And I never get as far as the debates about how pointless it is in terms of it's more expensive than life in prison, it's not a deterrent and all that bullshit. Because the real issue is that I've watched 6 people die in front of me, and it's always in the middle of the night. And that's because we're sort of deeply ashamed of it. And, you watch some poor guy suffer to death, and that's meant to show how civilized we are. And, you come out of there and you look up at the stars and you say, wow, did that just make the world a better place? And it's sort of summed up in this puerile little phrase that we always used to use in the US, which is, why do we kill people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong? It's just silly. And we get it wrong so often. We execute innocent people all the time. But, obviously I wouldn't be in favor of it if someone did it. But at the same time, anyone who is has got to announce rather loudly how many innocent people they're willing to kill.
I watched your TEDx talk, and you told the story of, forgive me, I didn't note the name down. Is it Ricky Langley?
Ricky Langley,
am I right?
Yeah, you're better at names than I am.
And there was an interesting... So if anyone hasn't watched that who's listening, I'll put the link in the description of the podcast so that we don't just basically go over the whole TED talk again, because I'm sure Clive doesn't want to do that. But
well, it's an amazing story, actually.
It is an amazing story, so people should go and watch it. There was an interesting thing you say in that, though, where you say that governments try and teach victims to hate rather than understand. And I thought that was a very interesting line. I wondered if I could get...
Well, it is extraordinary that the government, and Tony Blair did this when he was talking about rebalancing the system in favor of victims. And we tell the victims of crime that it's going to make them feel better if we really abuse the person who did it, which is an amazing thing. I don't know about your parents. Did they sit you down and say, little James, if someone does you wrong, I want you to hate them forever and slap them about as much as you can?
All the time, yeah.
They did. Well, that's why you're so screwed up, James. That's all right. You're creating a defense here on your podcast. But it's sort of like when you think about Priti Patel and the whole, and obviously you don't want to think about Priti Patel, but
I try and avoid it.
Yeah. But, with her and the hostile environment that she and Theresa May came up with, I always think to myself, look, whereabouts are you? In London, is that, James? Where are you?
Yes, yeah.
So
I'm in Southwest London.
If you were driving into London and you came to the sign that said, welcome to London, and instead someone had changed that to, fuck off, we hate you, this is a hostile place, don't come to London. It's not a nice thing to do, and it's not really a positive way to go around the world. And the same's true at some level when the government tells victims that they should hate people. Because let's face it, we've all done bad stuff. And actually, my mum, who was a very nice woman, tried to convince me that we should understand people rather than just despise them. And, in very, very brief, in the case of Ricky Langley, the mother there, Lorelei Guillory, Ricky clearly killed his 6-year-old son, but he was deeply, deeply mentally ill. And Lorelei ended up testifying not only that she didn't want the death penalty, but that she thought he should be in a mental hospital. And Lorelei is one of my great heroes. I mean, she won't mind my saying this. She's an alcoholic woman from Southwest Louisiana who never had much of a chance in life. And yet she was able to behave in a way that I respect with just immense degree. In fact, I hope to goodness you'll get her on your damn show and make her famous around the world, because I think she's an extraordinary person. And that's what we should all do. And I had this really ironic case out of Texas where I was representing a guy called Mark Stroman, who had been a real racist. He had really turned around, but he had tried to kill a bunch of Muslims after 9/11. And one of them was Race Bouillon, who was this extraordinary guy who Mark didn't manage to kill, but he killed 2 other people. And Race wanted to forgive him. And, ironically, under Islamic law, he could do that if he wanted, right? The victims can say, I don't want him killed. I don't even want him to go to prison. So Race tried to do that. And we went to the governor of Texas, who refused to even talk to Race. He'd just have Victims Appreciation Day, but because Race wasn't the sort of victim he wanted to deal with, he refused to talk to him. And it's ironic, isn't it, that we say Sharia law is so awful, but actually it was a whole lot better than Texas law. And, that's really interesting to me that we just take such an absurd view about what we should encourage victims to do. Because, I've been there when people are executed, and I'm here to tell you that your life is not going to suddenly get better when someone gets killed in front of you.
I also watched a Vice little documentary.
What have you been doing with your last week, James? Is this
just watching lots of stuff about
torture and
what you
abuse.
do? Yeah, it's been interesting. But there's a bit in that where you receive some hate mail, and I was wondering how frequent that kind of stuff is, because I guess for some people they can't reconcile the fact that you're defending who in their eyes would be bad people, and I'd sort of use sort of inverted commas in that, because like you said, everyone's done bad things. It doesn't necessarily mean you're that person forever, Sure. But I was wondering how maligned your sort of profession is in terms of being a defense.
Look, I don't care about that stuff. I find it all rather entertaining. I mean, I think it's very sad in the sense that you get some intensely hateful thing from someone out of the blue who's got nothing better to do than to send me hate mail. But actually, I find it quite entertaining. And, every now and then you get this mad stuff from the governments too, which look, I loved it one time when it was pretty terrifying when I first got it, because these people have just sort of got a lot of power and are rather serious sometimes. But one time I was being threatened with 40 years in prison for allegedly smuggling Under Armour underpants and Speedo swimming trunks into one of my clients in Guantanamo Bay. And I get this letter, right? And I just checked it wasn't April Fool's Day, because I thought it must be. And they're just crazy, because first, I couldn't do that because you're on camera the whole time. Second, look, let's face it, Speedo swimming trunks should be a criminal offense. But the only place that my client, this was Shakarama in Guantanamo, the only place he could actually swim was the toilet, because there isn't anywhere else. So I wrote him a really rude letter back saying, when I'd calmed down a bit, saying, look, I'm going to give you free legal advice for nothing. All you've got to do is post a sign over the toilet saying, we don't piss in your swimming pool, so please don't swim in our toilet. And that solves the problem, right? And the idea that this is a criminal offense, that they want to send me to, and obviously I didn't do it. I hate to admit that I was innocent. But, you do get this stuff. I'm not bothered by the hate mail, but I am sometimes bothered by the government threats.
That leads us nicely onto Guantanamo, doesn't it? You do a lot of work in Guantanamo. You actually told me you're going, is it week after next? You're going to Guantanamo. I watched another thing last night, which was the Reprieve.
In your loser life, I mean, when do you ever do anything else? I mean, this is extraordinary.
I wanted to be prepared. Don't want you to think I'm not putting in effort,
My mother hasn't watched this much stuff. And
so I watched the Reprieve film made by Asif Kapadia and Mose Def about force feeding.
Yes.
And I'll put the link in the description of the podcast and anyone watch it, although it is a very difficult watch but I didn't quite realize how awful force feeding the process is, because like you said on something else, it's like you picture it just being someone forcing a spoon of food down someone's throat, but obviously it's not.
You probably think waterboarding's all right too, don't you?
Well, no, because again, that's another thing. But I remember watching that years ago. I remember Christopher Hitchens subjected himself to waterboarding.
I got to do it to George Galloway, which, he came to my garden and I did it on camera.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of people who said, why didn't you invite me?
And so these sort of methods that seem clearly torturous, etc., that's going on in a place that Obama said he was going to shut when he got into power. Clearly, he never did, because you're still going there. I'm not quite sure what the question is there.
Well, we were talking about the force feeding method, and that's actually very illuminating. Because look, when they first started going on hunger strike, and you remember when the IRA folk who were interned went on hunger strike.
Yeah,
the British let Bobby Sands do it till he died, poor chap. And while I don't like people being in a position where they end up killing themselves, obviously, nonetheless, it was out of respect for his political decision there, and it had a huge impact. Now in Guantanamo, the American government didn't want to do that, so they start force feeding him. But they began when I first had my clients being force fed, they used a little tube, stuck it up your nose, and they left it up there, right? And then they wouldn't do it they weren't. People in hospital have tubes up their nose for that sort of intubation, and the idea is not to torture people in hospital, right? But then this guy called General Brance D. Craddock of Southcom said to the New York Times that they wanted to make it less convenient for these people to go on hunger strike. So they made it a bigger tube, and it's 110 centimeters long, and they would pull it out after every go as opposed to just leave it in. And they did it just to make it painful. Now, what's first, they shouldn't do that. But the idea that they do that and then they tell the New York Times that's what they're doing and that there isn't a revolution is a sad commentary on society. And so, Mose Def, or Yassine Bey, as his real name is, volunteered to do that for us, which was really cool that he did it, because I'm here to tell you, James, that you and I, sad to say, I'm not saying you're not incredibly famous, but we don't have quite the same number of fans as him. And so he did this, he let us do it to him, and he wept like a child. And it was really painful for the poor chap. And 10 million people watched it. And I think that got the message across to a number of people about what it was really like. And Ahmed Rabbani, who I'm going to see when I'm in Guantanamo, because I'm going there for his hearing that he's going to have, not a trial or anything so much as that. But Ahmed Rabbani was very patient for years after they'd rendered him and tortured him. But then on February the 5th, 2013, he'd had enough and he decided to go on hunger strike. He's been on hunger strike ever since. That's 8 years he's been on hunger strike. And he went down from 160 pounds. He's now 78 pounds when I talked to him the other day. So as he says, which I always like his sense of humor, he said, more than 50% of me has escaped this awful place. And we did a little website for him so that we could chart how he's escaping from Guantanamo. But he's been force-fed every day for the last 8 years in this torturous way. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, because that is the thing that about that film is that I think that like the tube falls out on the first go, and then so they try and put the tube back in, and he just breaks and is sort of pleading them to stop, and is like, I'm not acting, that like this is real, like I can't do this, and then just breaks down. And that it was similar to the Christopher Hitchens waterboarding video, because I remember in that he's given like 2 metal bars that he's supposed to drop if it becomes unbearable, and it lasts. He's not waterboarded for long before he's dropping those metal bars, and it's a point he made at the end of that video is, you know, those sort of torture methods, like waterboarding, etc. You know, it'd be bad enough if you had information that they wanted about where someone was, but most of these people that are waterboarded don't have any information to give anyway. So imagine having to go through that and knowing you can't give them anything to possibly stop it.
You know, it gets worse than that. There are a couple of things on that. First, I have a little hobby, which is to compare what we as Americans have called enhanced interrogation techniques, which we insist is not torture. We compared that to what the Spanish Inquisition called it. And if you take waterboarding, which we say is an enhanced interrogation technique, Spanish Inquisition said it was tortura del agua, as in water torture. So they were honest. But the Gestapo called it verschärfte Vernehmung, which means enhanced interrogation technique. And there's something deeply, deeply wrong with the fact that we as Americans are borrowing from the Nazis. But then to your other point, it's actually not true that the people have nothing to say, because when they get tortured, they'll say anything. So they make stuff up. And with Ahmed Rabbani, Ahmed is this fantastic, you know, he's nobody, right? I hate to say that. I don't mean to denigrate him, but he was a taxi driver in Karachi, and he was sold for a bounty. Let me just do a little quiz with you there.
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to offer you $250,000 if you'll just tell the authorities that I, Clive, was in Tora Bora in October 2001. Will you do it?
No.
Yes, you will.
You've got to say no, though, haven't you?
No. Most people say yes. But
I wouldn't. I like to think I wouldn't, right? But if you're putting yourself in the position of you're not being tortured yet, right? You're just no. I was going to say, so putting yourself. I would like to think that I wouldn't sell someone for that amount of money, but if you put yourself in the position of someone who maybe doesn't have anything, and you think that's however many years' wages for someone,
and also, you are an astoundingly famous and well-heeled podcast person, and I can describe for all your fans the quality of the keyboard over your right shoulder, the 2 guitars, the little spaceship from Star Wars that's over on that table over there. Anyway, so look, with Ahmed, he was turned over to the Americans for a bounty. And they said he was a guy called Hassan Gul, who was a terrorist. And he says, no, I'm not. I'm Ahmed Rabbani. I'm a taxi driver. And they didn't believe him. So they rendered him to the dark prison in Kabul, where they hung him up, stripado, what the Spanish Inquisition used to call stripado. And, you know, he said all sorts of stuff when he's being tortured. Of course he did. He was there for 540 days. And the really shocking thing is then, after all that time, he was rendered to Guantanamo, and he's still there. And his wife had been pregnant. He didn't even know that. His son was born after he was taken away. Never met his son, who's now 17 years old. But anyway, we learned later that the Americans captured Hassan Gul, brought him to the same prison, set Hassan Gul free. The guy went back to being a terrorist and was killed in a drone strike.
Sorry, they set him free.
They set him free because they're madmen. So in the meantime, Ahmed had made all these statements under torture. Of course he did. Then we get to when Trump's in office, parenthesis, I didn't vote for him. the only way to get someone out of Guantanamo was to cop a plea deal with the prosecution, right? Because then they had to let you go. So we tried to cut a deal for Ahmed. And we spent days and days with the FBI debriefing Ahmed about what he knew. But the problem is he didn't know anything worth knowing. And the things they wanted him to repeat in a trial were the things they'd tortured out of him. And I honestly said to Ahmed, I said, look, I'm not going to tell you to lie, but I know they're going to set you free if you repeat these things. But it's up to you whether you do or not. And to Ahmed's great credit, although perhaps a little mad, he refused to do it because he said it's not true. I mean, they tortured that out of me, but I made that up. So they wouldn't set him free because he wouldn't repeat the lies he'd told under torture when they wanted him to repeat those lies in a military commission. I mean, it's just a crazy world, isn't it?
Because I was listening to, a while ago, I was listening to a podcast by, I think it's Josh Dubin, like the Innocence Project lawyer, wrongful convictions, junk science. And it was about, false confessions and about, and obviously not in relation to Guantanamo and torture and stuff, but just how easy it is for people to falsely confess something to something they didn't even do, and which most people would think, well, I would never do that. But they sort of outlined how easy it is for people to get into that state. And you add in then torture into the mix. It's easy to see how people would just make stuff up just to make the pain stop.
Oh, totally. And, it's actually what you say is very, very true and is counterintuitive, but I've dealt with it a lot over the years, which is when people falsely confess without torture, And I guess the best example I can remember is a guy I was representing one time who was pretty mentally disabled, right? His IQ was, below 70. And I was trying to work out how to convince the judge how limited he was, because the judge wasn't a lot smarter, to be honest. And so in the end, what I had to do, and it was awful, it really was awful, but I had to humiliate this poor guy in public because he didn't know what a lot of words meant, right? And so I was a bit of an authority figure to him, surprisingly. And so I asked him, I said, Jerome, did you assassinate President Lincoln? And he had no idea what the word assassinate meant. So he would just try to guess from your tone of voice what the right answer was. And he said, yes. And so I thought I'd try my luck. Did you assassinate President Kennedy? Yes. New Kennedy assassination theory. And then this was when Reagan was still around. So I said, did you assassinate President Reagan? And he said, yes. And because the judge was a Democrat, I said, oh, well, Reagan's only brain dead. And, it's just so easy to do. And you would never think, but the proportion of people on death row who are, borderline mentally disabled is phenomenal. And it's largely because they're such easy targets, It's surprising.
And that's kind of almost come full circle, really, about, I sort of started this telling you that I had Jerry Buting on the podcast, and you think of, I think a lot of people maybe were made aware of false confessions, like for coerced confessions, whatever you want to call it, being a thing when they watched Making a Murder and they saw Brendan Dassey.
Brendan clearly meant disabled.
Who's clearly not up to the task of understanding what's really happening.
But neither was his lawyer. I mean, Brendan's lawyer. I watched that program. I thought it was a fabulous program. And I watched that, and there wasn't a single piece of evidence introduced into Brendan's trial that was admissible. And this lawyer's just sitting there, happy to be on television or whatever. And it's just awful. And, Brendan won initially on his federal habeas appeal. And then the Sixth Circuit overturned it. But, what a scandal. I mean, that kid, I would never have convicted his uncle, but Brendan, God, that kid should never have been prosecuted.
So there you have it, Clive Stafford Smith. My thanks to Clive for joining me on the show. My apologies to him for it taking so long, and my thanks to you, the listener, for joining me this week. We are planning now to be on a bi-weekly basis for the foreseeable future. So hopefully you can rely on some good last line podcasting material for the foreseeable. But that's not all that is coming your way. There is also another podcast I've been working on for a while now with my good friend Elsa Grace. It's a film podcast. It's called Cruise Next. The first episode of that will be dropping into this podcast feed that you hopefully are subscribed to now. It will be dropping onto that feed very shortly. So please do listen out for that. And please go and give that some love when the first 2 episodes will be dropping very, very soon. Also, you can go into the description of this podcast to find links to some of the other things that I'm up to if you want to stay up to date with that. And please do share the podcast with your friends. Tell everyone you can about it. Spread the word of The Last Line. I promise we will not be going anywhere as we have done recently. So, thank you all for listening. I've been James Albarn, and this is The Last Line.